welcome. I'm Olas Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Reforming the labor market, opening the land market, developing exports and increasing international trade are the main priorities of the Ministry of Economic Development of Ukraine. This was stated by Minister Tymofiy Mylovanov. Meanwhile, the draft law on Ukraine's state budget for 2020 has already been submitted to Verkhovna Rada. Will the new budget of Ukraine comply with the country's economic priorities? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio today by Dmytro Yablonovskyy, Deputy Director at the Center for Economic Strategy. Hello and thank you for joining us, Mr. Yablonovskyy. So, first of all, what are your thoughts on this draft law?
I think the draft law on state budget, it shows some figures which I would say related to moderate increase of the budget revenues and expenditures. On the one hand, it's not expansionary budget, and on the other hand, it's good because it will allow to keep macroeconomic stability. It will allow keep low inflation and will reduce risks because on the one hand, we can increase the budget to stimulate the economic growth, but on the other hand, whenever we increase the budget, it also raises the corruption risk. So, in my opinion, we should rather create opportunities for private growth, private investment growth, which will fuel the growth of GDP, rather than trying to boost the economic growth via increasing the budget. And in this case, moderate budget increase is good for the economy.
Well, the Ministry of Finance expects GDP growth of 3.3%, but at the same time, Prime Minister Honcharuk was talking about 7%. Why do you think the figures differ, or where the ongoing reforms calculated in both forecasts?
Basically, there are different approaches and goals of forecasting the GDP growth by Ministry of Finance, for example, and by Prime Minister or Minister of Economy, because Ministry of Finance, it should be kind of more conservative because it bases its forecast of tax revenues, for example, based on the GDP growth. So if it overestimates the GDP growth, then the actual growth will be lower, then we have the risk of not enough taxes collected. So in this case, for the purposes of the budget planning, I would agree that a conservative estimate is okay, but of course, as for the purpose of the kind of economic planning and government program planning, we should set a more ambitious goal, like 5 to 7%.
But what figure is more realistic, 3.3% or 5?
I think 3.3% is achievable just, so to say, doing nothing. We just, the state should not just do anything particular, but we can achieve this goal. Why? Because we have achieved macroeconomic stability, and we also have some new businesses coming, and we have some good signs in the economy for that. But again, if we want to drastically increase the economic growth, then we should think of some extraordinary and measures which, as I know, are being considered now by Ministry of Economy and Agriculture, as it is called now, because they are really thinking in what ways they can boost the economic growth.
Well, and according to this 2020 draft budget, the deficit is estimating to be around 2% of GDP. How would you compare the deficit with the last year? I think, from what I remember, it was around the same figure.
Yeah, it is relatively the same. Besides, the Minister of Finance, Oksana Markarova, claimed that the overall or long-term goal for the Ministry of Finance is to decrease the size of the budget, budget deficit relative to the budget size and relative to GDP. So basically, we don't expect anything unusual, except for the fact that we hope that finally we will renew the cooperation with the International Monetary Fund, and we'll get funds from this organization. And usually these loans are cheaper than comparing with the case when just you borrow from private borrowers, and also these loans usually they open the door for other opportunities like loans or grants from other international financial institutions like BRD, World Bank, etc. So they're all watching the cooperation with the country and the status of the cooperation of the country with the IMF, and if the cooperation continues, then we have higher chances and lower interest rates for other loans.
Well, you said that the deficit is about the same as the previous year, but at the same time, the draft budget allocates more money on healthcare. It's about $400 million US, more on defense, because this is the priority, of course. Education, social policies that take 10% of the budget, pensions, so $7 billion US will be allocated if adopted for pension payments, and pensions might be increased by 8%, minimum wage might be increased also. So we see that expenditure rise, the deficit stays the same. So this forms the question, where is Ukraine planning on getting this much of income, or is Ukraine planning on increasing an international debt?
I think the main aspiration of the Ministry of Finance is that as the economy grows, you will increase the tax revenues. Basically, how you can increase them, there are two ways. For example, if the revenues of this certain company increase, then you have, for example, higher taxes on these revenues. I mean, the tax rate is the same, but because the revenues as the base increase, then you have higher tax revenues from the company. So this is one scenario when actually the tax rates are not changed, but due to growth of revenues, incomes, we have higher tax revenues into the budget. The other scenario is also trying to decrease the shadow part of economy, and in this respect the parliament already passed, trying to pass new laws on this avoiding schemes on, for example, using too much cash within trade, etc. So basically, there are plans to reform the retail trade to decrease the amount of shadow operations. So if they are a success, it will be also an additional revenue from taxes.
Plus, as far as we hear from the media and from different experts, privatization reform and land reform could also benefit and provide lots of revenues to the state budget. If I'm not mistaken, according to the World Bank, opening the land market would benefit into 15 billion US annually. What do you think of that figure, and what do you think about opening the land market? Because as far as we see, Zelensky is a big supporter of this idea, and he even ordered his government to prepare the legislation and submit it to the Verkhovna Rada. But there has been a lot of discussion around this reform. There has been a lot of controversy whether it should be restricted somehow or not, because the main idea is that foreigners and wealthy people might get a total control over the Ukrainian agricultural land and buy everything, well, it's impossible, but all the 43,000 hectares of Ukrainian land. So what are your thoughts on this reform, and whether it should be restricted or not anyhow?
So the idea of this reform, it's not about, actually, at least in current framework, not about increasing immediately budget revenues, because it's not planned to sell immediately all the 10 million hectares that belong to state, because they would be rather transferred to local authorities.
So only 10
million hectares belong to state now, and about 28 million hectares belong to private people who are not also able to sell this land. So basically, moratorium, it covers both state-owned land and privately owned agricultural land. So when the market starts, it covers again both state-owned land and privately held land. And for the state-owned land, at least currently politicians say that they're not plan to sell it massively. Of course, some of the state-owned land should be sold, which is not used by the state, but overall the idea is that it would be transferred to local authorities. This is part of the decentralization reform, when local authorities would would be given additional resources. But land reform would stimulate investment. Why it would stimulate investment? Because currently most of those farmers or companies who process the land, they usually lease the land. They lease but not own the land. And the idea is that at least in some cases, when the state or the private owner are ready to sell the land, they can sell the land to those companies, to those farmers. And when the farmer becomes an owner of the land, his business planning horizon increases substantially. For example, if you want to grow a garden, then probably you need 10-15 years for that. But if you just lease the land, you're not sure if you can lease this land in 5 or 10 years. If you can buy the land, then you are sure that you are the owner of this land in 10 years, and then you can invest. So the main idea behind opening of the land reform, on the one hand, it allows those people who own the land to sell it if they want to. On the other hand, it allows the farmers or the agricultural producers to become owners, to buy this land, and then increase the business planning horizon, which will increase the probability of further investment. And this investment then will be further impacting the economic growth or GDP growth.
Another interesting aspect to discuss, Andriy Radchenko, the chairman of the state-owned agrarian fund, told to Radio Free Liberty that Russia was using scare tactics to convince Ukrainians that rich foreigners would gobble up all the farmland. That's what I mentioned in the previous question. And this is probably the main argument and the main fear spread by Zelensky's opponents. Do you think that this fear has enough ground to somehow impact and subsequently maybe forecast some bad outcomes from the land reform?
So I would start from setting the scenario. So of course we really think about some limitations, but rather we should think not about limitations, but why we want this limitation. And the reasons are that we want a level playing field or equal opportunities for both small farmers to buy the land and big agro holdings to buy the land. In this case, the correct solution would be not to limit someone, but to provide opportunities. For example, if we believe that small farmers do not have money to buy the land after the market is launched, then we should offer them some loans. And indeed, this program is already being discussed, and what already the Prime Minister mentioned, and also other politicians, that there will be at least 4.4 billion hryvnias in the budget for the next year, which can be distributed as loans for the farmers, for small farmers, to buy the land. And the interest rate can be, for example, 5% per annum in hryvnia, which is, I would say, quite low and affordable. So in this case, we should not rather not limit somebody, but create equal opportunities, and loans would help to create equal opportunities for small farmers.
Right.
Another limitation that is being considered is a limitation on concentration. So basically, we don't want anyone to buy all the Ukrainian land, despite the fact that it's impossible, because it's really a huge amount of money which none of the oligarchs has, and even foreigners could not afford to do so. But in any case, if we think that concentration is not good for the economy, we should set some limits, and it is now being discussed, for example, to set a limit on 0.5% for the total land in Ukraine, but also set some certain limits on ownership in one hands in, for example, oblast level or even rayon level. And in this case, I think these limitations are possible and then can be justified. So basically, returning to your question, on the one hand, we should not rather limit but create equal opportunities. On the other hand, for the concentration, yes, we can have limits, and they are being discussed. And as for the foreigners, basically, at least now it is we are told that physical persons, foreigners, would not be allowed to purchase Ukrainian land according to the new draft law. But again, we should wait for this law to be published. Hopefully, it is published in October, and then we can discuss it in more detail.
And the very last question, because we're running out of time, but still it's very important, just briefly about privatization. Every government has been launching this privatization reform, and Ukraine was trying to sell some big state-owned enterprises and to get some output from there, but every government has been failing so far. Why do you think this year the new government can actually succeed?
At least I see a new Minister of Economy who doesn't have any vested interest in SOEs, to my best knowledge, and then there is a proposal for putting a new top manager for a state property fund, which also seems to be an independent candidate. If we don't have vested interest among politicians, then I think the privatization process can be speed up, because this opposition can be blocked, and finally we can start not only small scale but large scale privatization as well.
Well, let's see what will be the final version of the budget 2020 after November 2nd, expectedly. Thank you so much for your comments.
You're
today.
welcome.
That was Dmytro Yablonovskyy, Deputy Director at the Center for Economic Strategy. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.